Have you ever had it where you had trials piling up in your life, one on top of another after another after another, where you're going through an extremely painful time in your life and nothing seems to be going right and everything seems to be going wrong? And you might wonder, does God have a purpose in all of this? Sometimes we might not even think that, and we might think that God is against us in some way. And so we start to struggle and we wonder what's going on in our lives and why all these trials are coming up all at once. We're not talking about something that's spread out over a period of several months, like maybe within the day or maybe within a couple of days. And we're talking about very hard-hitting trials that just come upon you in your life. And you wonder what's going on and does God have a purpose? Well, I got good news for you. When trials come in your life, they're not purposeless. And God can accomplish some amazing things, both in you and also for the sake of other people. And that latter part of what I just talked about is something that we're going to be looking at in the next couple of weeks, in this week and next week, as we start to unfold the story of the conversion of the Philippian jailer. And it's really one of those things that has to do with Paul and Silas meeting another one of God's divine appointments to reach out to somebody who needs to hear the gospel. And the path that they take to get there is not a path that they're choosing. Trust me, it's a path of hardship and real. It's just hard. It's just hard. I would imagine we're going to go through the hardship part of it this week, and then go into what happens in the jail next week. But you can imagine it was very a trying time for both of those men. So we're going to go over that, have some good things we want to unfold and talk about. Hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you are listening to Loving the Scriptures. You know, it was years ago, I was part of a small group Bible study. And I'm trying to think if this passage here in Acts 16 was the topic of conversation when we started this particular night, when we were together as a small group. I want to say yes, but I'm not 100% sure. But when we were together in a small group, the small group leader asked the question and said, what is something that happened to you during a particular day that gave you an indication that you were about to have a bad day? And everybody went around and they shared, stuff that had happened. It didn't necessarily have to be recently. It could have been like from a month ago or whenever. Just sharing something where, like, when I knew that happened, I knew that I was about to have a bad day, and sure enough, they'd have a bad day. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and a whole series of events happened where they just didn't have the best of days. And so it was, so when we talk about this whole thing about bad days and going to have a bad day, we're going to see that with Paul and Silas here. This is 1 week out of 2 where we're going to finish up chapter 16. We're about halfway through. About halfway through this chapter now. We've spent the last couple of weeks looking at the first 15 verses. Now we're going to finish up, but when I divide this up, we're going to look at this in 2 ways. In the first way, we're going to focus more on the trials that Paul and Silas experience that leads them into the jail in Philippi. Because it's really, when you really look into it, you really realize that, there are a handful of things that just went wrong for them, at no fault of their own. This isn't anything where they made a mistake and got themselves into trouble and things like that. This was things that were totally outside of themselves, as far as anything outside of themselves where they did anything wrong or illegal or anything like that. We're not even dealing with something like that. We're dealing with let me tell you what we're dealing with here. And if you want to get to the true nuts and bolts of it, you're dealing with something spiritual. And I've mentioned this before. A lot of times when we see the negative things in the book of Acts, there just seems to be a spiritual feel to it. So I believe that one of the things that we're going to see in this is a very strong uprising from the evil spiritual realm, where all these things happen to Paul and Silas, not knowing, however, the evil spiritual realm, not knowing that they're playing right into the Holy Spirit's hands. Okay, so there's in some way there's a battle that's going on with this, where I think the evil spiritual realm is on the attack, but at the same time God is still in control. And as God is in control, He leads Paul and Silas into this Philippian jail to enable in order to conduct His work that I believe God had set aside for them all along. But to get to that point, to perform this work that God would have for them in encountering the Philippian jailer, they're going to have to take a very painful path. So we're going to look at the painful path today, and really at the tail end of what we want to see today. We're going to see the attitude of Paul and Silas, and I really want to hone in on that and talk about that a little bit today, and then a little bit next time, because I think it's such an important thing that we see how Paul and Silas really take on all of these things that are happening to them. In another way of putting it is, what does this do to their joy? Is their joy destroyed? Is it wrecked? Is it ruined? Or is their joy intact? When we look at the end of our passage today, we're going to see that their joy is very much firmly intact. It's an amazing thing to see. We'll talk about that later on. And then next week, we'll go into the whole thing of what happens in the jail, the Philippian jailer himself, and just everything that he had been going through, why he wanted to kill himself and that sort of thing. But so we're going to see the lighter side of things next time, and just seeing God at work once again, just as we've seen Him do throughout the whole book of Acts. God is at work, even in the most trying circumstances and in the most troubling settings. Even when we're talking about Paul and Silas in prison, in jail, we're not even talking about them just being locked behind a door. And again, we'll get to that. We'll get to that a little bit later as well. But so that's how we're going to divide this up. We're going to finish up chapter 16 this week, and then next week as well. We're going to use these 2 weeks to cover the rest of chapter 16, and then what I'm probably leaning more towards is taking a break at the end of chapter 16 to cover another aspect of the gospel. I think I told you before, I wasn't sure whether I was going to proceed into chapter 17 and take some weeks to cover chapter 17 and then take that break, or if it was going to be the end of chapter 16. And I'm leaning more towards taking that break at the end of chapter 16. If I stick with that, then that's going to be in another few weeks then. This week, next week, and then after that next week, when we finish chapter 16, we'll take that week to cover another aspect of the gospel. Okay, so that's kind of where my thinking is right now. And so yeah, just so you know, just kind of the map and just where we're headed at this point. Before we proceed further, there's one correction that I want to make from last time, because I believe in the last episode, one of the things that I said is that I talked about how the gospel had potentially spread into the northern areas of the territory where Paul and Silas and Timothy were journeying. It's a hard word to say, journeying. And I talked about Bithynia, because remember how they had been barred from going into Bithynia when they tried to go in there. The Holy Spirit stopped them from going in there. And I said, and one of the speculations that I was laying out is that that perhaps people who had heard the gospel way back at Pentecost, when they were scattered, a lot of them may have gone back to Bithynia and preach the gospel in their own place. And I said the reason why I say that is because Bithynia is one of the places that's listed in chapter 2 where people were hearing their own language, people from this part and this part. And I said that Bithynia was listed in that list in chapter 2. And then afterwards I kind of thought, is that really true? And I looked it up, and Bithynia is not in that list. And I think I was getting that confused with Cappadocia, which is also in that northern region, but it's a little bit farther east. Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia. That's what's listed in the in Pentecost, where it talks about all those different areas where people came from. That doesn't mean, however, that there were no people from Bithynia who had come down to Pentecost and heard Peter preach and accepted Christ. I'm not saying that, therefore, that probably didn't happen. It very well could have happened, I wouldn't doubt that something like that happened. The list in chapter 2 is not an exhaustive list, I don't think. So you very well could have had people from Bithynia come to Pentecost and hear Peter speak, turn to the Lord, and then when the scattering happened in chapter 8, they go back to Bithynia and preach the gospel. That very well could have happened. But the mistake is, I was saying that Bithynia was one of the places that was mentioned in Acts chapter 2, which gave a little bit more surety of that actually having happened. And upon further inspection, I realized that Bithynia isn't in that list. It's Cappadocia. I was getting that confused with Cappadocia. So just wanted to set the record straight on that. And whenever I make a mistake, I try and point it out. If I discover it, sometimes there's mistakes that I make, or I misspeak, and I don't discover it until weeks later. I'll give you a good case in point. And I never brought this up, and I never realized it until much later. But if we go way back to one of those episodes where we're looking at the aspects of the gospel, when we were talking about reconciliation, and I was talking about how people before Christ, their relationship with Christ beforehand was as an enemy, so they were enemies of God, and talking about just kind of the seriousness of that whole thing of being an enemy. And what enemies look like and things. And I made a reference to Batman, and I said, it's just like Batman and Robin, that those two are enemies. Now, of course, if you're familiar with the comic book world, or even if you're not familiar with the comic book world, you're probably familiar with Batman and Robin. And you know that Batman and Robin are not enemies; they're allies, right? Robin is Batman's sidekick. That was one of those. That's another example where you misspeak. I know it's in my head, and I know that Batman and Robin are not enemies; they're allies. What I meant to say was Batman and Joker. It was in my head. What came out of my mouth was Batman and Robin, and it's so annoying when those mistakes happen, and you realize it, on down the road. What can you do? But anyway, so yeah, whenever I goof up, I try and lay it out and try and bring the correct information. But so let's get into our text where we left off in our study of this chapter of Acts chapter 16. We've seen the conversion of Lydia. So you remember Paul, Silas, and Timothy, and Luke. They've arrived in Philippi. We know that there isn't a high population of Jews there because they don't go to the synagogue. Instead, they go to a place of prayer out by the riverside, and they encounter some women, one of them being Lydia, who it says was a worshiper of God, and maybe she was a proselyte to Judaism, maybe she wasn't, but she was there among these women. These guys preached the gospel to them, and it says that the Lord opened Lydia's heart to receive the message and to pay attention to the message. And so she becomes a believer, and she invites Paul and his entourage to stay with the household. We get an idea that the household became believers as well, whether it was just directly through Lydia or whether in coming to visit the household, the disciples preached the gospel to them. Whatever the case may have been, the message got to the household as well, and they believed, and Lydia and her whole household were baptized. Okay, so there we see a beginning point of what would eventually become the church in Philippi. And, when you read the text, you get the text in Acts 16, you get this understanding that Paul and Silas and the rest of the people had been ministering in Philippi for a little while. And by the time you get to the end of chapter 16, you read things about the brethren, which gives you this understanding that they're probably ministering to people and bringing other people to the Lord. And you still, the church in Philippi is still probably pretty small, but you're getting different people who are coming in and accepting the Lord. So you see this kind of gradual growth of Christians there in the city of Philippi. And it all started with Lydia. She was the first convert there, and then followed by her household, and then with some other people. So we see something very good, right? But then remember what I've said in describing the book of Acts. The book of Acts, you see a lot of it's a big roller coaster ride. So it has its ups. Sometimes it has its very high ups, and then it has its downs. A lot of times the down follows immediately after the up. In the same situation here, you have this situation that comes up where, well, you know what? Let's just read the text, okay? So let me read the text. I'm gonna break this up in a couple of sections here. First section here, I'm gonna start in verse 16 and read through verse 18. Okay, so verse 16 through 18 of Acts chapter 16, where we pick up on our story. Okay, so this is what it says. It says, as we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination, and brought her owners much gain by fortune telling. She followed Paul and us, crying out, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation." And this she kept doing for many days. Paul, having become greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And it came out that very hour. Okay, so there's our first section there. So we get an idea of just how this whole fiasco gets started. And the thing about this situation, I mean, it's not, obviously we know that it's not like Paul and everybody else was going around as if they were looking for trouble. As it says there, just in the start of this passage, it says they were going to the place of prayer. That's it. I mean, they weren't going to bother anybody. They weren't going, it's not like they were going to the marketplace and they were, preaching on the streets or anything like that. They were just going to the place of prayer, which is what they did last time, which is what they did last Sabbath. And that's where they met the women. Maybe they're going to go there to meet and pray, and then hopefully maybe run into some other people with which to whom they could share the gospel. That could have been a possibility. But whatever the case, they're just going to the place of prayer. And remember, just as I reviewed for you before, when they go to the place of prayer, something excellent happens. They run into some women, and they end up preaching the gospel, and Lydia ends up coming to know the Lord. That's a great thing. Now they're going to that same place of prayer, and here we have another woman, and this woman isn't somebody that you want to run into. And as it says there in this text, it says, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination. Now, let's just talk about this for a little bit. The term spirit of divination, by the way, in the Greek, literally it means a spirit, a python spirit. The whole thing of divination, the spirit of divination, the word for python, it shows up in the Greek. And that's drawn from Greek mythology. I'm a little bit rusty on this, but the python was a snake that guarded was kind of set up as a guard at Delphi. Delphi was a sanctuary where there were oracles where people could seek information from the gods, and the python was killed by Apollo, and after the killing of the snake by Apollo had the ability to give fortunes to people who came and sought fortunes from the gods or information from the gods. I also had read, and this was kind of something different from another portion of this that I heard, where one of the things that people would do was that, at Delphi, they would lay down on the floor, and they had snakes there. They had actual snakes there. They had actual pythons that would crawl over people's bodies. And again, remember, this is mythology. They would crawl over their bodies, and it was through that way that people tried to get access to communication with the gods and fortunes from the gods. And even going through this whole rigmarole was supposed to affect their future in some way as well, I believe. So, again, the python, the actual python killed by Apollo, and people sought after that. People sought their divining fortunes through him. But whatever the case, that's good. There's two sorts of sides to this where, I heard one side and then I heard something else. And I said, well, how does one connect with the other? It doesn't seem like it goes together. But I mean, I think the prevailing thing that we need to understand here is that, these oracles, the python was very much connected to that. And it was very much connected to seeking revelations of the future from the God. So really what you have here, it's very pagan in nature, obviously. And so the python was very much connected to that whole thing. And so that's why in the Greek that word kind of shows up there. Because that's kind of what the surrounding area kind of understood. That's how they were connected to that whole thing. So really, when it comes to divination and fortune telling and things like that, in that culture and in that society, what that means is that whenever people came to them, the fortune telling was they were seeking advice from the gods. They were seeking to know the future from the gods. I mean, if you wanna consider it along the lines of a first century Greek edition of a psychic or something, people going to see their psychic, I guess maybe you can say that. I think it's a little bit more involved than that in the first century. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what kind of information people sought to extract from these people, from these diviners, if they were looking for something specific as far as it related to their future, whether they were, whether they were saying, am I going to get married, or how's my crops going to be? I don't know. I get the suspicion that it's not just trivial questions, though. That's just a hunch on my part. I haven't done deep research into that to figure out the nature of the questions. But the thing is that this was a somewhat of a booming business. There was high demand for that. And again, this was all part of the culture. This was all part of the pagan culture. And so this woman was a part of it. Now, the thing is that we're not dealing with a woman who's just saying, hey, if you want your fortune told, come to me and I can tell you. And, it's just a regular woman. What we read from the text is that this is a woman who was indwelled by a spirit. This is a real spirit who, through that spirit, was able to fortune tell. And so that's what that's saying there. She had a spirit of divination and brought her owners much gain by fortune telling. Okay, so that was her business, and she was indwelt by the spirit. Now, with these people coming to her for answers to whatever they were seeking, in seeking fortune tellers and things like that. Again, like I said, there's a very pagan idea behind it, but what many of them may not understand, maybe some of them do understand, but maybe a lot of them don't understand, is that what they're actually coming in contact with is a demon who is imitating the whole system that these people have fallen into and what they're participating in. So it's no different from what Paul says in 1 Corinthians, I believe it's 1 Corinthians 10:20, I want to say, where it says that this is a rough paraphrase here, but where it says that the pagan systems that people participate in are imitated by actual demons. That demons are actually running the show in that. So, I mean, the whole system is fake, but there is something behind it that's pulling strings and everything like that, and that's the evil spiritual realm. Those are demons. And so you see the same thing here. You see that this woman has an evil spirit, a spirit of divination, and through this spirit, she's able to tell fortunes. So right off the bat, we see something evil and spiritual in this whole thing, as it relates to this woman. And so Paul and Silas happen to stumble upon this woman here. Now notice here, Luke is eyewitness to this. Because remember, Luke is now in the story, and he's eyewitness to everything. Remember, it says there in verse 16, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination. Okay, now notice she's a slave girl, and it seems like her number one job, I guess if you want to call it that, was this fortune telling. And as people came and paid her to tell their fortune, the money would go to her owners. Whether she got a cut of that or not, I don't know. But I mean, what's of concern here is that the owners were raking it in through this whole thing. So for the owners, she's this slave girl, this poor slave girl, who is tormented and indwelt by this spirit, is being used by these people in order to bring in money for themselves. The whole thing of greed. I mean, it's very evident when you read something like this. And so this slave girl, it says she brought her owners much gain by fortune telling. All right, so that's who we're dealing with there. Now, what is it exactly that this slave woman is saying to or about Paul and his group? I mean, you would think that if you had a demon-possessed woman who comes in contact with this small group of Christians, that he would start to badmouth them, that he would try to that the spirit would try to discredit them. He would go around town and saying all these untrue things about Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke and everything. And listen, I believe that in the spiritual warfare of things, a weapon that they can use is trying to get people to discredit you in some way, in some false way, so that people don't pay attention to you, so you're not able to mention the gospel to them because you lose credibility. I do believe that can be a weapon that the evil spiritual realm uses. But that's not what's used here, and it's a very interesting. It's kind of, when you read this, it's kind of a head scratcher, and you might even wonder if this is if the demon is trying to even destroy Paul and Silas at all with this, because look at what the text goes on to say in verse 17. It says, "She followed Paul and us, crying out, 'These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation.'" Now, wait a minute here. That's the exact opposite that you would expect a demon-possessed person to start saying about these people. It's almost as if she's doing the advertising for them. Hey, you want to hear about the gospel? You want to hear about Christ? Come listen to these guys. And it's not like she's making an imitation. She's just saying who these guys are. It says, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation." And that's true. That's true, isn't it? And I think this is one of the big things that gets under Paul's skin. As we read there in the following verse, he gets so annoyed that he turns around and he drives the spirit out of her. But we get the idea. In fact, let's just read it here again. In verse 18, it says, "And this she kept doing for many days." So this wasn't something where she just did this once, and then Paul said, "You know what? In the name of Jesus Christ, I cast you out," or anything like that. This happened for many days. Okay, how many days, we're not sure. We just know that it's many days, which also gives you an understanding and an indication, again, that Philippi was a place where Paul and Silas and Luke and Timothy planted themselves for a while. They were actually doing authentic ministry. It wasn't where they preached the gospel for a little bit and then move on. They're spending some time there. And probably a lot of that time is cultivating the new converts that they've already made through Lydia and the household and things like that. I would guess is probably one of the biggest things that they were doing. But while they were there and as they were out and about, this slave girl who's possessed by this demon of divination is going around and saying that for many days, saying what she's saying and saying that these men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation. So this happened for many days, and then still in verse 18, Paul, having become greatly annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And it came out that very hour. Okay, so there you see this exorcism here, and this woman is free. Now, we don't hear anything about the woman anymore. Her part of the story is done. Part of you wonders, did she come to know the Lord after that or not? You don't know for sure. If I had to guess, I'd say no, because I think if she did, I think Luke, being as detailed as he is in certain places, would have mentioned that. But just because he doesn't mention that doesn't mean that she didn't come to know the Lord. Ultimately, we don't know for sure. Okay, I hope she did, and I hope I get to see her in heaven. But again, let's go back to this whole thing. So we get this understanding in verse 18 that Paul is not hip to this idea of this demon-possessed woman following him around and saying that these people are telling you the way to salvation, that these are servants of the Most High God. He's not hip to that idea. And you might think, well, I understand that this is a slave girl who's possessed by a demon, but if she's saying the right things, why are you so worried about it? Why not just let it go for a little bit? Well, the thing is that probably one of the biggest things is that if you're part of that group and you're wanting to be used of God to spread the kingdom, you do not want that word coming from the mouths of the evil spiritual realm. You don't want that. It's kind of like that's number one. You don't want that coming from the mouths of demons. And connected to that, number two, what's connected to that is that as Paul and Silas and everybody else are ministering, as they're doing their thing, if people come to know the Lord, or if they're on the cusp of coming to know the Lord, here comes a slave girl who comes in, and then they're familiar with her and what she's been saying. She's been advertising for these guys, and so they're not only listening to Paul and Silas, but they also give a willing ear to this woman as it relates to Christianity. I think they may have given her a willing ear if they were still in paganism and she was telling their fortunes. But when it comes to Christianity, if they're on the cusp of coming to faith, or if they have come to faith, you still have this slave girl who's been advertising for Paul and everybody else. And so they would think there's no problem turning my ear towards this woman as well. And that's the subtlety of the whole thing of drawing people away. See, that's the whole thing. Satan is slick. I think this was just a ploy that would be used to draw people, potential converts mostly probably, but maybe even very newly born converts just coming to know the Lord, to draw them away from the one true God and the one true Savior. I truly believe that that's a big part of what is going on here. But even in an overall sense, what we have to understand is that you don't want right advertising coming from the evil spiritual realm. If you remember back in during the election year in 2016, this isn't anything spiritual. This is political, actually. If you paid attention to the news and election news and things like that, you remember one of the big things that was a problem for Donald Trump when he was running for president was that you had the KKK and white supremacists and other people who were endorsing Donald Trump essentially, and saying that we believe that he's going to do the right things as far as this, and this, and so you had you had people saying, "Whoa, wait a minute," and they're looking at Donald Trump and saying, "Donald Trump, what do you say about this? Do you disavow this whole thing?" I don't think Donald Trump responded the way that he should have, or in the right manner. He was kind of wishy-washy and stuff on that. And that's not to say that I think the president's a racist. I think that he was just trying to pander for votes, even though he might have been against those people. But whatever the case may be, it might be right, it might be wrong about that. But again, it's that whole thing where Donald Trump wants to be president. And here you have these people from a group that societally in our country, we don't like those people. Racists, white supremacists, Ku Klux Klan, that sort of thing. And they're speaking positively about Donald Trump. And everybody's wondering about Donald Trump. Are you going to disavow them? Are you going to say, I don't want your vote or anything like that? I mean, I think if you look at things strategically and politically, that would be what's expected of somebody if there's an endorsement that comes from that side. Where it says, I don't want their vote. I don't want to them to endorse me or anything like that. They would be, from a regular political strategical standpoint, I think normally what people would do is they would stand up and say, I disavow everything that they say and everything that they do. I don't want them associated with me in any way, right? And I think in this situation here, you kind of have the same thing. This is kind of the same thing. You don't want this advertising, and it's right advertising that what the slave woman said isn't wrong, but you don't want that association with the evil spiritual realm and have that connected to you. And I think Jesus had the same idea in mind. If you remember, I'm turning here. I think it's in Mark chapter 3, where, give me a second here. This is I'm looking at Mark chapter 3, and this is where, Mark is just giving this general description of, these people coming to Jesus and Jesus ministering to them and healing them and things like that. And it says in chapter 3, verse 11, it says, "And whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, 'You are the Son of God.'" Now, what came out of those demons' mouth? Is it true? Absolutely. Absolutely, it's true. They're crying out with a loud voice, "You are the Son of God." You think, now, what in the world? But look at verse 12. This is Mark chapter 3, verse 12. It says, "And he, Jesus, he strictly ordered them, the demons, not to make him known." And I think the whole idea behind that is that you don't want that testimony coming out of the mouths of evil beings. Okay? Because again, here's the thing that you have to understand. We understand that in the evil spiritual realm, and even with the descriptions of Satan himself, we know that Satan is a liar. He is the father of lies. Every time he opens his mouth, lies come out of his mouth. He speaks his native language. That's what Jesus says in John chapter 8. Now, one thing that we don't want to make the mistake of doing is that that when we take the meaning of that, we say that that everything that the evil spiritual realm says is always a bold-faced lie. The sinister part of Satan is that he mixes some of his lies with truth. It's part of the hook. That's part of the draw. I think this was part of the hook that Satan and his minions were trying to use through this slave girl, this demon-possessed slave girl. Have a little bit of truth in there, and then later on down the road, introduce some falsehood and some heresy. Okay? I think that's what it means. We're not dealing with spirits who lie when they come out. When they just come out of the blue and they say, the sky is purple. I mean, that's a bold untruth, right? We're not dealing with that necessarily. Sometimes you might, but again, the sinister part and the slick part of Satan is that in a lot of cases, his lies are sprinkled with truth. Now, I think in this situation, I think you have the truth part coming out, and I think the lies were reserved for later, is my speculation. I think that's probably what you had going on there. And probably what you would see down the road. Paul eventually had enough, and he turned around and he drove the demon out of this slave girl, and she's finally free. She's finally free. So there's a good thing that happened. I mean, just as far as we're talking about the freedom of this woman, but this just digs a deeper hole for Paul. Okay, it was bad enough that they had continual encounters with this woman. That was bad enough. Now that she's free, you would hope, okay, everything's good, everything's fine, we're cool now. Not necessarily, unfortunately. As you read further, and let me read the rest of this passage here, and then we'll go back and pick things apart. So if we pick up in verse 19, this is how the story continues to unfold. It says, "But when her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. And when they had brought them to the magistrates, they said, 'These men are Jews, and they are disturbing our city. They advocate customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice.' The crowd joined in attacking them, and the magistrates tore the garments off them, and gave orders to beat them with rods. And when they had inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into prison, ordering the jailer to keep them safely. Having received this order, he put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. Okay, so just a whole series of bad events. The first event that we see is their encounter with this woman in the first place. And you just kind of wish that she was never in this position in the first place, and wish that she was always free. But that's not the case. She was demon possessed, and she went around pestering Paul and Silas and everybody else, trying to pull a fast one on everybody by starting out by speaking truth, but probably having lies reserved later on. And that's bad event number one. Bad event number two is what we see here after the woman is set free from her demon. Okay, so again it says, but when her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. Okay, so notice that the trouble that Paul and Silas encounter isn't produced by them preaching the gospel. Now, I think that their preaching of the gospel, in whatever way that they did that in the city of Philippi, whether it was in public places or whether it was, here and there among groups of people, may have been known by people, and they used that as their springboard to bring charges against Paul. Not because they were first and foremost annoyed with what Paul and Silas and everybody else was saying about the gospel, but it was because they just ruined our business with this slave girl. Because remember, this woman who had the spirit of divination was bringing in much profit, was bringing in much gain. So these guys were getting rich. Now with the spirit gone and with the fortune telling, no more, they're like, we lost our business. We lost a lot of money here. And when you mess with people's money, depending on who you're talking about, but when you mess with people's money, the claws come out. The claws came out here. So this was the trouble came from the fact that their greed was no longer able to be scratched. That itch was not able to be scratched anymore, because they lost maybe one of their main sources of revenue. So they seized Paul and Silas and they dragged them into the marketplace before the ruler. So they drag them in there as if these are criminals and that they're in trouble, And so here's another bad event. Another bad event, and you see a series of bad events within this bad event. So they're dragged into the marketplace. Now, the marketplace, in the middle of the marketplace, the agora, different agoras, was a place where stuff like this happened, where judges decided cases and things like that. If you're looking at this and say, why did you drag them to the marketplace? Because they had areas in those marketplaces for things just like this. That's where they met. That's where they decided cases and things like that. So that's where they did. That's what they do. They drag them over there, and they send them before the rulers. Now in verse 20 it says, and when they had brought them to the magistrates, they said, these men are Jews, and they are disturbing our city. Now a couple of things to notice here. The very first thing to notice here is that they point out what kind of people these are ethnically. These are Jews, and I think that that's one of the stressing points of their case against them. Not so much, it is partly what they did or what they're going to accuse them of doing or being responsible of, but it's just they throw out this whole thing where they say, hey, keep in mind, guys, these are Jews. These are Jews. Now, I think that in that pointing out of that, followed by what's going to follow later in the accusations that they make, you have, just kind of in that emphasis, this whole idea of anti-Semitism. Now, why do I say that? Because remember, it just says that they seized Paul and Silas. Now, were Paul and Silas the only people around when all of this stuff was happening? No. What about Luke? What about Timothy? They aren't seized. They aren't dragged to the marketplace. They aren't made to stand in front of the judges. Luke is a full-blooded Gentile, and Timothy is half Gentile. He's half Jew also, but he's got Gentile blood in him, and they probably left him alone. And they were doing nothing different. They weren't doing anything more different than what Paul and Silas were doing while they were there. Okay? And you got to wonder, I mean, with the whole thing with Silas, you notice, because remember, Paul is the one who drove the demon out of the woman. So you'd think if there was any sort of problem, it would just be with Paul. Since Paul is the one who committed this deed, they would just drag Paul before the magistrates. But they don't. They grab Paul and Silas. Why are they dragging Silas into this? I don't know. But you get a clue of it here. Just in the start of their accusation, it says, these men are Jews. Oh, well, now, that's where the real problem is. The problem is anti-Semitism. And that's not just something that's just taken out of nowhere. That was a real thing back then. And it was a real thing on the other side, too. Remember, we talked about the Jews' attitude towards the Gentiles and things like that. That's not anything that Paul or Silas held for the Gentiles, just from a spiritual point of view. But culturally, there was a two-sided thing where there was animosity and distrust between Jews and Gentiles. So it was two-way. But here, these Gentiles, these Romans, because remember, this is a Roman colony here. They used their Jewishness against them, against Paul and against Silas, who didn't even drive the spirit out of the woman. So it says these men are Jews and they are disturbing our city. Now, how are they disturbing the city? How is it that they're disturbing the city? Well, he goes on and explains that in verse 21. It says they advocate customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice. Now, that seems pretty broad. It seems to be a broad accusation. What exactly? What customs are they advocating? You know, if this is in some way a reference to them preaching the gospel, that's one thing. But I mean, it's here they're saying they're advocating customs. You think about preaching the gospel, you think about Christianity, you wonder what customs are they actually talking about that's connected to what they would be saying about Christianity or about Jesus Christ. It seems to me if we're talking about preaching the gospel, he's just saying, repent of your sins and believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. As far as customs, I mean, what do they have to perform some sort of ritual or something like that? What is it exactly that he's saying when we're saying, they're advocating customs? What customs? He doesn't go into detail on that. Now, in fairness, maybe they did go into detail about it, and Luke just felt that he didn't need to record that. But from the reader's perspective, it just seems pretty vague. And maybe he was vague in real life because they knew that that's all that it really needed to take, especially when you're dealing with these troublesome, rascally Jews. Maybe they knew that it wasn't going to take much. They're just saying that they're just throwing everybody into confusion and into chaos by what they're advocating. Now, here's the thing where we get the clue that what's being brought here isn't necessarily having to do with what Paul and Silas are saying or anything about the gospel, at least not primarily. Again, their primary beef is that they've lost their ability to make money through this slave girl because Paul has freed her from her demon. Okay? And that's not even brought up. We have something totally different coming out here, where he's saying they advocate customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to accept or practice. If that's some sort of convoluted way of describing them preaching the gospel, let's just say that it is. We'd have to ask the question: where were these guys before? Why didn't they seize them and drag them off to the marketplace before? Because remember, they've been doing this for several days. And now you're bringing this up. Now you're bringing them before the judges. Now you're bringing them before the magistrates. Why? Why now? Why not before? They've been there before. They've been around doing their thing before. Why are you now doing this? So we see this as, there's a lot of, it's not genuine. Well, maybe there is a hostility, an actual hostility towards about the things that they're saying. It's just not primary, though. Their whole beef is, we can't make our money through this by this slave girl anymore. And we're ticked about it. And we're going to do something about it. So we're going to grab them, we're going to drag them off, and we're going to mention this whole thing. And I would imagine that whether they had a real huge problem with their preaching the gospel or not, what they present forth and saying that they're advocating customs that are unlawful for us Romans to accept, they're using a line that would resonate with the judges. Now, of course, it resonates with everybody else. Notice what happens here. And this is where we get deeper and deeper into this hole here. That's tremendously unfair. Verse 22, it says, the crowd joined in attacking them, and the magistrates tore the garments off them and gave orders to beat them with rods. So notice, everybody just seems to turn against them. What the crowd was saying, I don't know. And maybe they were saying, okay, this is what I heard them saying about this, and maybe they were laying out things about what they said about the gospel. I don't know. But whatever the case is, it didn't take much for the crowd to get involved in this, and the crowd joined in attacking them. Whether they're saying, yep, what this guy is saying is true, and whatever, but who knows. But now the crowd is in on this. And so what you see next, as the crowd enters this whole thing, it says there in the middle of verse 22, and the magistrates tore the garments off them and gave orders to beat them with rods. Now that's a pretty painful way of receiving punishment. Not necessarily the same way as what we see in, when we think about the lashes that Jesus got with the whips that he got, but it's still a pretty severe thing. According to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul had to go through this 3 times. Not here in this instance 3 times. I mean, this was one event out of 3 where Paul was beaten with rods. This is one of them here. And again, this is Paul and Silas. And again, Silas didn't have anything to do with this. But one thing that's noteworthy about Silas is that he's not one who says, wait a minute, I didn't have anything to do with this. I didn't do anything. Talk to Paul. He's the, it wasn't anything like that. I think silently and indirectly, I think one thing that we see from Silas here, we have a certain dedication and loyalty to Paul, where he's not concerned about defending himself. If there's going to be suffering, he's willing to suffer alongside of his brother in Christ, as they go through this whole thing, which I think is pretty amazing. So they get beaten with rods. Now here's the injustice in this whole thing. There's no investigation. There's no conviction. There's no nothing, which would have been standard for them to do. That's not just me imposing 21st century legal process, American legal process onto first century situation. No, that would have been standard for them to do at that time. Investigate things thoroughly, come to a decision, say, I charge you, you are hereby convicted of this. I mean, if they find them guilty, and then enact the punishment. But you notice what happens here? The crowd gets into the whole thing of attacking them, and then they say, okay, let's beat these guys. Which kind of makes you wonder, I mean, if one of the main reasons for them doing that was pressure from the crowd. Because if they had investigated anything, I think that they would have come up empty. They would have said, these guys haven't done anything wrong, which would have really turned the crowd into a tizzy. But the crowd there was attacking them, and I wonder if they felt pressure from the crowd and felt like, well, I need to do something. This is what I need to do. Let's just have these guys beat and then throw them in jail, call it a day, move on with our lives, that sort of thing. I mean, perhaps. Maybe the same thing. You see the same thing with Jesus as well. Remember when Jesus and Barabbas were before the crowd, and Pilate said, "Which one should I release to you?" And you might get the sense maybe if the owners were kind of drawing the crowd into this in some way or whatever. I don't know. We know that that's what happened with Jesus when you read in Mark chapter 15. I don't know the specific verse, but in Mark chapter 15, read that chapter where Pilate is going to make the decision, it says that the Jewish leaders, the chief priests, went around and they turned the people and convinced the people to shout for Jesus' blood and to have Barabbas let go. And so there you have the whole crowd saying of Jesus, crucify him, and that's what ends up happening. So I think maybe in some way you got a similar thing going on here. And so the magistrates say, okay, so be it. And so they strip them down and they beat them with rods. Now notice in verse 23, and it says, and when they had inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into prison, ordering the jailer to keep them safely. Okay, now it says there, they inflicted many blows upon them. How many blows? We're not sure. It was just many. I mean, one is probably too many. I mean, that stuff probably hurt. And they were beaten with many blows. So they're battered, they're bruised. They don't look normal now, probably. They got beat pretty bad. In other words, I think is what we can draw from this. Without any sort of investigation, without any sort of corroborating evidence or anything like that, they had the whole crowd turn against them for some reason. And so you would imagine for Paul and Silas, this is a very lonely feeling. It's probably got to be so lonely. And through the injustice of what happened, through this system where the due process, if you want to call it, if you want to say that, didn't happen for these guys. It just simply did not happen. And again, I think part of the push for that was the fact that they were Jews. I think that had a large part of what to do with that. Okay. So they're thrown into the prison, and so they tell the jailer, and this is our jailer that we're going to talk about more next time. This jailer is the one is given the orders to keep them safely. Now, he really takes that order seriously, because when you read in verse 24, it says, having received this order, he put them into the inner prison, which I guess if you want to put another term, a familiar term to that, maximum security, right? Maximum security cell, maximum security prison. Okay, he would put them into the inner prison and fasten their feet in the stocks. Now, the whole thing with the stocks is that it's not simply a matter of they were locked inside of a room. And in fact, I don't know if there was even really a lock if he had stocks in there. Maybe with a latch or something, but the stocks was what really kept them secure. And you had stocks on the walls. I think you probably had something that was for their wrists and something for their feet. And the way that the feet were arranged is that they were spread out as far as possible as they're chained to the floor, making it very, very uncomfortable. So it's not like, so they're in a cell. It's not like they're in a cell and they can move around and pace back and forth or whatever. They're chained in the stocks. And it's not like in the stocks, it's like they're just chained and, just have a limited mobility. When they're fastened to the stocks, they're really immobilized. And in a very uncomfortable way, so that even with their legs are spread out wide apart and then fastened in the stocks. So it's it would cause some pain in the legs and some cramping and things like that. And that's what happened with Paul and Silas. And it all came about from this good deed that Paul did in driving a demon out of a woman and setting her free. That's how this whole thing came down. Truly unfortunate. Truly unfortunate. Here's what I'm going to do. Let's talk about verse where am I here? Let's talk about verse 25 next time. I was going to get into verse 25 and talk about that. I'll read it here, but I want to expand on it a little bit more next time and talk about it. But I'll do that next time. But here it is, verse 25. It says, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. Isn't that amazing? They were singing hymns to God after all that they've been through. After all that they've been through, they find time to sing praises to God. Their worship of God, their joy in God is not touched by the circumstances. And I want to spend a little bit more time talking about that, but I think I'm going to reserve that for next time. Okay. We'll talk about that next time and then continue on and finish the rest of the story next time. But here we've seen the tremendous trials that these guys have gone through, and it's to say that they had a bad day is an understatement. But what we're going to see is they're going to go from trial to triumph. And we're going to see again how all of this is set up for Paul and Silas to meet a divine appointment in their encounter with the Philippian jailer. Okay. And so this is truly an amazing outcome that comes out of this. So that's what we're going to look at next time. So let's go ahead and leave it there. Okay. We'll leave it there. If you like this show, and if you haven't done so already, and maybe you're listening to Loving the Scriptures for the first time, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on iTunes. Also check me out on Twitter, Loving the Scriptures on Twitter. The handle is at LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS. Maybe I should say that slower. LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. I get so used to it, I just kind of blab it out there. So, that's at LT Scripts, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. All right. So, a lot of good things we're going to look at when we continue this story next time. So come back and join me here. We'll finish it off. We'll see what God does. We'll see that it's amazing, and you'll be blessed by it. I promise you. Okay. My name is Steve Gill, and I hope to see you right back here next time. Bye now.